Now, in the new apartheid era rather, Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh examines how apartheid reinvented itself. Says whilst many South Africans are aware that formal apartheid was abolished, he says he's looking at the extent of oppression and how it's continued in many systems in our country. He writes that this new apartheid is a privatized, decentralized, self-replicating vestige of the apartheid state and won't be dismantled unless we understand it. Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh joins us now, the author of the new apartheid and creator of the Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh Xperience. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Glad to be with you, Tsepiso. Thanks for having me.
So you've spoken about how when putting this book together, you had to do extensive research about the architects and thinkers of apartheid. So when examining this, the historical framework of apartheid, was it mainly political, or were you looking at the practice of separate development and its other inherent features?
Well, I was doing two things, and two things that I think are extremely important in this moment. The first was to try to understand the scale of the apartheid project and the sheer reach and remit, in other words, the grand ambition of the apartheid project. But on the other hand, I was also trying to understand apartheid as an idea. We often think we know what apartheid means, particularly people in my generation, because we may have seen a documentary or even read about it at university. But the idea itself is a lot more complex than we imagine at first. And so I was trying both to comprehend the monumental scale of the apartheid project, which I believe still persists into the present, but also deconstruct apartheid as an idea.
So then just talk to us about what conclusions you reached, especially with regards to cultural or racial identity and how this architecture was put together, because I'm thinking, were there similarities that you found in past self-proclaimed fascist regimes like, say, Italy or Nazi Germany, and did they follow the same trajectory in their evolution?
Well, one of the key conclusions that I reach in the book is that apartheid did not die, it was privatized. And in my research, particularly in the late apartheid era, it became evident to me that apartheid's architects, its economists, its politicians, its thinkers were well aware that a democracy was on the horizon. And so the idea was to make apartheid reinvent itself, even if a democracy would become possible. And that's a key thing that I think we need to appreciate. The privatization of apartheid in the private realm has often adapted around the democratic constraints which we've placed for it in 94. In addition, in terms of the ideology which you mentioned, I think the interesting thing about apartheid, in distinction perhaps to fascist ideology and some of the other racial ideologies that we've seen in other parts of the world, in the United States and Europe, is that it's an ideology of minority control. And so how do you get a minority to control a majority? That was the project that apartheid's architects focused on, thought about and implemented over generations, and that's the project we need to uproot.
So you also mentioned that the architects of apartheid were always clear that they wanted apartheid to outlive even a democratic state, and as you say, you've seen the tentacles of it and how it's manifested. And it's quite interesting when you talk about the manipulation of an ideology that we've had a very long and concerted effort fighting against this racialized, state system. So how was it able to continue to breathe life?
Well, I think in the transition to South Africa's constitutional era in the 1980s and the 1990s, you had two contending forces for liberation and forces for the conservation or the preservation or keeping apartheid. And the forces for liberation contended that if we created a constitution, if we created a democracy, and if we created rights, then the society would automatically over time self-correct in the direction of justice. But the apartheid negotiators realized that even if you declared a society that was just and free.
Dr. Mpofu-Walsh, we seem to have lost the connection to you. I don't know if you've gone on mute. Okay, I think you've muted yourself. Do you want to try again?
Sure.
There we
Was
go.
just saying that the forces of liberation contended that the creation of a democracy and rights would be sufficient to overturn the momentum of apartheid over time. But the forces on the apartheid side of the negotiating table contended that if we had a market that was structured in order to perpetuate apartheid, and if we had a state that was found it very difficult to govern from the center, and we preserved a decentralized system of state governance, then in fact apartheid would reinvent itself. And I think in many ways, some of the vision of the liberation movement has materialized, but some of the vision of the apartheid vision and priorities have materialized. And we need to appreciate the ways in which apartheid has reinvented itself and continues to have an afterlife after 1994.
So I'd like to hear your categorization of that. Some have argued that there's a colonial impetus to that reconstruction and development. I mean, in one of the chapters, you trace the new apartheid in crime and punishment. So how does that manifest as a result of structural barriers, inequalities, or violence of the past? What is it?
Well, I think to be sure, colonialism figures large in the South African present, but because of apartheid and this special variant or mutation, if you will, of colonialism that we have, we need to pay special attention to the way that apartheid itself has really taken over many aspects of private life in South Africa, even as public and democratic life has changed dramatically. And I think one of the key things to appreciate on that note is the way in which we punish criminally in South Africa. Staggeringly, there are more black people as a percentage of the prison population today than when we criminalized blackness during apartheid. And indeed, that system of criminal punishment has become increasingly privatized from within, as we saw with Bosasa, now African Global Operations, for example. That was the system which it latched onto for corrupt purposes. So the way that we punish petty crimes and we punish the marginalized with passionate intensity, but we have a society based on impunity, often for politicians, even for apartheid criminals themselves, I think begs us to reassess the extent to which we truly punish those we claim to punish and why we punish so fervently those who suffer the brunt of the new apartheid.
It's interesting that you say that, because earlier on you also drew, synergy with what is happening in the United States, especially in terms of that kind of structural violence. The recent violence that we saw here, was it an illustration of these kind of things that you're talking about, making your book prescient?
Well, look, I think what we saw with the unrest, upheaval, even acts of wanton criminality in certain instances was a very complicated moment. But one of the things that I think we should appreciate about that moment is the way that malls became a site of struggle and a site of rebellion and a site of activity. Now, why were people focusing on malls? Well, if private power exerts more influence over their lives, as I contend, than even state power, then malls actually are an interesting site of economic power where big conglomerates gather, where they are guarded by private security guards, where you have to look a certain way unless you'll be treated as a suspicious person. And so I do think we need to think deeply about why that moment, which was caused by a number of factors, grew into a certain spontaneous movement, a random and a rather dangerous, chaotic movement. But we need to ask why those who feel locked out of the economy continue to resemble those who were locked out of the economy before 1994. And I contend that the new apartheid takes us a long way to appreciating those currents.
So what are you suggesting in the book in terms of how to rebuild a new republic, if at all, and not just in terms of changing policy or finding new political alternatives?
Well, I think once we comprehend, as I say, the monumental scale of the apartheid project, how deeply it's rooted in all aspects of our lives, we begin to see that merely one change of policy, even a change of government, will be insufficient to overturn the momentum of this massive generations-long system. And so what I call for in the book, which is not the only thing we need to do, but is certainly one of them, is to reassess our very constitutional foundations and start imagining a new second democratic republic. What we would be living in now would effectively be the first democratic republic. We need to consolidate the important gains of a constitution, of founding a democracy, but we need to transcend our conception of justice and move to a new republic which is fit to contend with the powerful forces of privatized apartheid. And so we need to totally rethink and revamp our very republic if we're going to scratch the surface of the new apartheid.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts with us around the writing of the book, Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, on his new book, The New Apartheid.